Every time I sit down to write this, I wind up sitting here sobbing for hours. Do you know what it feels like to lose a parent? Do you know what it feels like to lose a parent to senseless violence?
The vehicle is passing 3rd Avenue, speeds of 100 miles an hour.
Almost every night, the same nightmare plays on repeat. I get a phone call around 9 at night. We think your dad is missing. Seconds turn to minutes, turns to hours. My entire family looking to me for answers, and I have none. But I still hold hope that they'll find him alive. 3 a.m. My phone rings. They found him. Dead.
Rescue response, the driver appears unconscious.
She's a murder suspect out of North Carolina.
I certainly never thought she would murder him. I wouldn't learn where until about a week later, where they found him, how they found him. My father was taken from me. I can't call him just to talk anymore, but I'm lucky. The last thing I said to him was, "Bye, Dad. I love you."
That picture. that sums up Uncle Jim. This is about when he stepped in to help my mom with us when my dad stepped out. And this is, around the times that my mom tells those funny stories about coming home and Uncle Jim trying to change baby diapers with clothespin on his nose. He was more than an uncle to me. He was a father figure to me. He gave up part of his life to help my mother raise my sister and I. She was a single mom of twin girls, and he gladly helped her raise us. He was the uncle that took me every summer and let me go lobstering with him and took me fishing and just make my summer. I very, very, very much looked forward to Uncle Jim coming to North Carolina. But I was definitely a little disappointed in where he bought a home, despite that being a brand new subdivision. If you went further down the road, there was a lot of rundown trailers and drugs and things like that. There's a corner store. You could probably go to the corner of Uncle Jim's backyard and throw something and hit the store. It was that close. And like most corner stores in rural North Carolina, this one really didn't attract the best crowds because they would gather around the slot machines and hang out in there constantly. The concern was not him getting in trouble with all of these people. My concern was something bad was going to happen to him in that area. I kept my concerns about Uncle Jim buying a house in that neighborhood to myself because at that point, what was I going to do? He already bought the house. So, it was just like, let him be happy. And he'll find out on his own and it'll be over. But no one thinks it's going to be over in the manner it was over for him.
It's your dad. I love you. I just wanted to talk to you, so give me a call for a change of pace. All right? I'll have to come all the way home to kick your ass. All right, love you. Bye.
That's my dad. I miss him a lot. And hearing his voice helps that. When all of this was happening with my dad, I went by Kellyanne. In 2020, I changed my name to Roman. I found out, figured out that I am trans, and so I've started to live my truth. So my dad, he was just the best thing since sliced bread to me. My dad was a kind and loving man. He really just wanted everybody to be happy and well taken care of. I grew up with my mom. My dad and her split up, and he moved to Nantucket. So on the weekends when I was younger, I would go to Nantucket and we would go out on the boat. He was a lobsterman and a fisherman for most of his life. My dad was very, very handsome, and he was a ladies' man. He's a very free spirit, so feeling tied down in a relationship is not exactly, when he was younger, what he wanted. I think that as he got older, he wanted to settle down. He was slowing down as far as his health and stuff goes, so I think he wanted just a companion, like a life companion. I think I was scared more than he was about the surgery. It was very, very nerve-wracking. I did something I don't usually do, which is I prayed. And I don't do that, but I did at that point. When the doctors came in and said everything went well, it was a huge weight lifted off. It kind of gave me a new outlook on life, his surgery, just because in a blink of an eye, it can all be taken away. So, after his surgery, he was on the up and up. He wanted a fresh start. And he found that in North Carolina, mostly because my cousin Victoria was down here and she loved it. The years after he moved to North Carolina were a little tumultuous for our relationship. I felt almost like he was abandoning me because he was so far away. And I definitely wish I had been better about keeping in contact with him. I just wish he was still here.
In the morning, we walk into our meeting room and the captain's going over the daily reports that came from the night prior, and the Pennoni case came up. What stood out to me about the James Pennoni case is the way the case came to us, the way that the family called. He was a missing person. They haven't talked to him in several days. When the family called, their concern was that he had recently had open heart surgery, and they were trying to see if law enforcement could find him. When the original call came out, the deputy was responding to what's called a wellness check. The deputy knocked on the doors, he checked the windows, he didn't see any signs of anybody in the house. He tried to call Mr. Pennoni, no one answered. There was no vehicle in the driveway. There was no signs that someone had been there in the last couple of days. They basically told them the vehicle was there overnight. When deputies ran the plates, that's when they found that it was registered to Mr. Pennoni. And then they connected the dots with Mr. Pennoni's missing person report. That is when the case was sent up to detectives for further investigation. I mean, no one just leaves their vehicle parked in the alleyway or in between two trailers and walks off. In a case like this, every minute counts. So we were already behind and we needed to move to find One, why was his truck there? Two, where is he at? We couldn't drag our feet. I felt that Mr. Benoni was hurt, killed. Just now it's by who, by what, where, when, where is his body if he was?
When I first saw this house, I thought, how amazing. Look what you got for yourself, this beautiful new home. And now when I see this house, it gives me knots in my stomach. Like to me, it looks like the House of Horrors. They met when he was playing the slot machine at the convenience store right next door to his house. And that's when most of us didn't hear much from Uncle Jim anymore. I did hear that he told my mom that he was very excited because she was a pretty woman. She was smaller in stature, had long, beautiful hair, and he was really excited that someone was paying attention. When Uncle Jim met Sandra, he kind of just shut off on everyone. Well, we figured, hey, he met a woman and, he's living his own life. He's got his new home. He's got a girlfriend. Let's let him do his own thing, My mom called me and she was just panicked. She was telling me that she couldn't get a hold of my Uncle Jim. She's like, please, can you just drive there? Can you go check on him? I feel like something's wrong. I was picturing him either hurt or sick inside of his house. Has he had a heart attack? I dropped everything I was doing and just head straight to Uncle Jim's house. I pull up on scene and I, hop out and the deputy's like, who are you? I was like, well, I'm his niece. I'm, his family member that lives in North Carolina. And they're like, do you have a key to the house? And I was like, no, actually I don't. And I don't know why I don't, but I don't. He was like, well, basically there's nothing I can do for them. I asked the deputy all these questions. He did have a bypass. What if he's laying on the floor? And, he explained to me the difference between entering for a well-being check or, an actual medical situation. It was extremely frustrating to me that we could not forcibly enter the home. And then he just randomly brought up this flower garden. He's like, oh yeah, I noticed it looks like he just recently started a flower garden in the backyard. And I was like, what are you talking about, this flower garden? His backyard is like a half acre of dirt. He would never just plant a flower garden on dirt. And then I started thinking about it and I was like, oh gosh. I was like, that is just like a terrible sign. Your heart is just racing, takes your breath away a little bit. It's almost like you could just jump out of your own body. If it was up to me, I would have grabbed a shovel and dug up that garden myself. I just knew. I called my mom and I told her, I said, I think he's gone. You just feel like someone's just gone. They're no longer here.
Social media, which was how we communicated most to get in touch with him. I also was calling his cell phone number, just kept going to voicemail. I knew something was not okay. The fact that he wasn't answering multiple phone calls from myself was very alarming.
At this point in the investigation, I'm still up in the air on whether Mr. Pannoni is just not wanting to talk to family, just out doing his own thing. I mean, he's 61 years old. He doesn't have to check in with anybody. So at this point, it was just whether or not Mr. Pannoni is where he wants to be or not. When I go back to my desk, I'm looking at the photos of Mr. Pannoni's truck. One of the windows was rolled down and the keys were in the ignition. There were lumps of hair found throughout the car. It looked like someone got into a fight and the hair was pulled out. After reading the reports, looking at the pictures, it just did not sit well with me. Who was in the truck with Mr. Pannoni? What happened to the person? Why is there these chunks of hair in the car? I needed it to tell a story and it just was not lining up right now. The first place we went to was to speak with the girlfriend. She had told the deputies that night that she hadn't seen him in a couple of days. But I needed to know more than just when the last time she saw him. I needed to know, what their relationship was like. Was it rocky? Were they in good standings? Now we need to hear it from her, what was actually going on. We drove to Jones County where Miss Wagner lives. I asked her if we can go inside the house to talk. And while we're in the house, I began to ask her questions about Mr. Pannoni. I could see that she's getting upset because of the way I'm asking questions in regard to her relationship. So I asked her about her hair. I said, we found a lot of hair in Mr. Pannoni's truck. And that's when Miss Wagner said, I put Mr. Pannoni's truck in the trailer park. And she said, Mr. Pannoni told me to put it there. He was running away from law enforcement because he was in a car accident in Swansboro. And he was drinking and left the scene. And he didn't want to get arrested. Mr. Pannoni wanted to get rid of his vehicle, change his name so that he wouldn't be arrested by law enforcement for the accident that he did in Swansboro. And I'm like, okay, well, where was Mr. Pannoni when you put the truck there? And she said he was at home. But at this point, she didn't know where he was. What did you do with Mr. Pannoni? Was in my head. Everything that she said during the interview, it makes me believe she's lying to me. But I wanted her to feel like I believed what she was saying. I wanted her to feel comfortable enough to continue talking to us. We had no body, we had no crime scene, we had nothing. We needed more. I felt that Sandra was either responsible or involved in Mr. Pannoni's disappearance.
She looked like she had lived a decently hard life. I think he saw someone he could help in the beginning. And I think that he wanted to be like a knight in shining armor. And he tried. It was a couple of months into it, and there were some red flags that I had seen and heard. He had once told me that she had wiped his bank account and that she had struggled with drugs. That was when I really started harping on him about separating from her. He was very insistent that she had changed her ways, that she was on the right path now, and I wasn't so sure. I called him for his birthday in March, and he told me that he was separated and was very much so doing his own thing. I believed that she was completely out of the picture. That's what he led me to believe. That was the last time I talked to him. It was on his birthday. And I was lucky because I got to tell him that I loved him.
I called my mother when I was leaving Uncle Jim's house. My mom sounded distraught. She was anxious. She wasn't tearful yet. She was mad. And I know it's because she wanted answers. She wanted to know where her brother was. And she was irate with this woman. My mom stayed in touch a lot via social media messenger. And she had been sending messages to his account, and the messages were getting shorter. The language wasn't like his, and she said, I think that it's this woman using his phone sending me messages. This is not him. At this point, she was calling out Sandra. Sandra, I know this is you. What have you done to my brother? And then my uncle's social media was logged off. She said, something's happened, I just know it.
When I left Sandra Wagner's house, I was very suspicious of her. She stated that the accident that Mr. Pannoni was in happened in the next town over. I knew my next steps would be to make contact with a law enforcement officer in that town to see if we can verify that the accident actually happened and there was a report taken. The victim stated that he was hit by the same vehicle that Mr. Pannoni drove, but that the vehicle fled and he identified the driver as a female instead of a male. It made me believe that the only reason Ms. Wagner knew about the accident is because she was the driver and she's the one who fled. And the reason why she fled is because she didn't want to have any contact with law enforcement. I needed to find out what she did with Mr. Pannoni. The next step is searching Mr. Pannoni's house. Once we obtained the search warrant, we headed out there with CSI investigators. Honestly, I was hoping to find Mr. Pannoni in one of the bedrooms. I was hoping that he may have passed of old age, but that is not what we found. Walking into the house, I noticed that it was well maintained. It was cleaned. I hate to say it, for a 61-year-old male, it was very clean. When I walked into the bathroom, I smelled bleach, as if someone had cleaned it. He had a cloth shower curtain, and behind it wasn't the plastic. No one lives like that. You're going to put the plastic on to prevent the water from coming out. My automatic thought process was he's probably wrapped up in it somewhere. I can't 100% say, but that was what was going through my head. It being super clean suggests that someone cleaned it and got rid of all the evidence, everything that would have been needed to tell us what happened to Mr. Pannoni. There was no signs that we could see of an altercation happening there or anybody being stabbed or shot. There was nothing. They did Mr. Pannoni's room. They did the second bedroom to the right, but it was the third bedroom to the left that when they went in and they did the luminol, that it showed that there was blood on the bed frame and on the floor. Lit up where the potential for blood to have been. It is very apparent that Mr. Pannoni was killed there. At this time, I'm standing outside talking to my supervisors about the information we got. And as we're walking to the back of the house, we noticed that there was a flower bed. Brand new mulch, border, no weeds. My hair was standing on the back of my neck. And my supervisor starts pulling at the flower bed. Everything came up. All the flowers were still in the plastic pots that they come in. While they're digging in the flower bed, they were able to see plastic. And as they got closer, they did smell bleach. And so they continued, and once they did unearth the body that was there, were able to confirm it was Mr. Pannoni. And yes, he was in fact wrapped in the shower curtains. Now we know where he was killed. We need to know by who.
It was 3 a.m. when Detective Flores called me. Her voice was shaking a lot, and I just kind of knew that something was wrong. She told me where they found him, right outside the back door to his house, buried underneath a freshly planted garden of pansies. I don't even remember hanging up the phone, to be quite honest. I just remember running across the hall to my mom's room and kind of diving in bed with her. Just a mess. It definitely felt like a nightmare. It was more of a night terror. I thought at any moment I would wake up and it would be fine, everything would be normal, and Dad would still be alive, and it wasn't the case.
Mr. Pannoni was stabbed around 4 times in the heart. It looked like they attempted to dismember him by sawing through his elbow. Seeing that would indicate rage. Someone enraged stabbed him multiple times. Indicates someone who's in close connection with him. At this point, the prime suspect was Sandra Wagner. Because of the news being out there that Mr. Pannoni was found, there was a lot of moving parts that we had, so we had to move quick. So the next day, I needed bank records for Mr. Pannoni so I could track down when his last purchase was. The financial records came back, and we took each purchase and went straight to the company and was able to find after March, beginning April, there were no more purchases done by Mr. Pannoni. They were all done by Sandra Wagner. They did have surveillance. So we were able to get the time frame of the transaction and then go to the facility, and they were able to bring up the cameras for that time. And during that time, it would show Sandra Wagner alone making the purchase, and Mr. Pannoni was not there. One of the transactions were for a hardware store where she purchased 2 coolers. and then returned the coolers a couple of days after. And then I needed to also track those flower pots that we found at the site. So we photographed the flower pots and documented the UPC code that were on the flower pots. Based on the UPC code, we were able to track it back to a garden center where it was sold, where she would purchase bleach and cleaning products like that. And then, of course, the flowers, the border, the lights, the mulch that she put on the burial site. And then it shows her going to the ATM and withdrawing about $600. And then 2 days after that, she withdrew another $600. I can't prove it, but given that she did try to chop Mr. Pannoni up, I believe she may have tried to or want to use the coolers to place the body parts in there. Because of how difficult the actual plan was to perform, she stopped and had to come up with a new one. Sandra Wagner did this, and now here is the evidence showing that she was involved. And even though we don't have her actually doing the murder, this is circumstantial evidence surrounding it that would lead us to believe that she committed the murder. I needed to get Sandra back into the office and have a formal sit-down interview with her. I gave her a phone call, asked her if she would come in. She stated she wasn't going to come in until she spoke with her attorney, so we set up a time for, I believe it was 3:30 in the afternoon. 3:30 came, went, Miss Sandra didn't show up. I tried to call her a couple of times, and there was no answer. At that point in the investigation, there was a warrant issued out for her. She was a wanted individual. Not knowing where Sandra was, I felt like a disappointment. It's like, I had her, she was here, now she's running. How long is she gonna run for? How long until we actually get her behind bars and let her answer for what she did? Sandra was scared. And when you're scared, you do stupid things. And in this situation, it caused her to run from her actions. And I mean, you can only run for so long. When they found her leaving the grocery store, she took off in her vehicle and led them on a high-speed chase.
The vehicle is passing 3rd Avenue, Rossmore Circle, 3rd Avenue. Speaking to 100 miles an hour. I can't see her.
I lost visual.
All right, she's coming up on Columbia Highway. Somebody else take it, please. I'm too far behind.
Where she crashed into a tree.
Downgrade everybody.
Rescue response, driver appears unconscious.
No, not right now.
All right, she's
All right, what do we got? We got breathing?
All right, you got one? Hold on.
All right, just keep her stable. Just keep her stable.
Let me go get my phone. All right, she's coming too. She's coming too.
When I found out that she was arrested, I had so much relief because now I could tell the family we got her. Now they don't have to stay up at night worrying, is this ever gonna be finished? Are they gonna ever have closure? She's manipulated him since day one. She knew what she wanted when she got through the door. She knew what she was gonna use him for. And then eventually, when it became time that she couldn't get any more from him, she got rid of him. Working cases like this is why I got into law enforcement. I was able to help a family get through the worst time in their life. We were able to give them justice.
This is just, I mean, the first time I've seen that. But, you know, this is, my uncle bought this home, and this is where he ended up. It's just heartbreaking. I mean, these are the things I try to hide from some of my family members and hope that they don't have to see, but yeah, it's very hard to look at that photo. My mom was an emotional disaster. She could not stop crying. She was a mess. The hardest feeling in the world for me is to see my mom broken like that. And that's exactly how I can describe my mom, broken. She feels like she convinced him to move here, and had he not moved here, he would still be alive. She needs to let go of all that pain. She needs to let go and understand that Uncle Jim is in a good place, and it's time to enjoy her life again, and it's not her fault. That right there, that is Uncle Jim. Always shirtless, always barefoot, and always fishing. That's the way I want to remember my Uncle Jim. Every time I take my boat out, I think of Uncle Jim, especially when I'm out offshore. And you can just close your eyes for a minute and just like hear the seagulls and hear the waves and just remember a happier, simpler time.
That is the milestone that I wish my dad was there for. Also didn't get to know the real me. I think he would have been very excited to have another son, as much as he loved calling me his little girl. This is my graduation photo. He was so proud, and he... It was one of the only accomplishments that he was there for. And just the smile on his face. It was when he was so proud. And I was so happy he was. It was a really good day. I miss his hugs a lot. And he always kissed the top of my head. Telling his story is definitely a part of my healing journey. Definitely still in that healing process, and I really don't think that it'll ever stop. It just gets less. A way that I like to look at grief is the grief doesn't get smaller. You just grow up around it. So that's kind of what I've been trying to Do.
I'm sorry this happened to him. That he died alone. I just want him to be at peace. I hope that he's comfortable wherever he is, fishing. I asked him, can we go see him? And, where is he? And he just shook his head. You've become one person, and when that's gone, it's like half of you died. All of our plans we had, growing old together, all those things would never come to be.
It starts with a sound no one can quite agree on later. A door closing too hard, or maybe not hard enough. A hollow echo swallowed by humid Florida air. The kind that clings to your skin and dulls your senses. And by morning, she is gone, just gone, like a sentence cut off mid-word, like a life erased without warning. And what remains is not silence, but something heavier. Something that presses into the walls of that quiet neighborhood in late summer 1995. A pressure that builds and builds. Until it cracks into headlines, into whispers, into a cold case that refuses to die. They will say her name for years, in different tones, different rooms, sometimes softly like a prayer, sometimes sharply like an accusation. But on that night she is just a routine, just a pattern repeating itself. The porch light flicked on, the television murmuring in the background, the low hum of cicadas threading through the dark. Everything ordinary, painfully ordinary, the kind of ordinary that only becomes meaningful after it's gone. After investigators walk through that same living room and note what isn't there, what shouldn't be missing but is, the small disruptions that scream louder than broken glass. Her car is still in the driveway. Keys on the kitchen counter. A glass half full, or half empty, depending on who tells it, sitting beside a stack of unopened mail. No sign of struggle. No forced entry. No blood. Just absence. Pure, impossible absence. And that's what shocks them first. Because people don't just disappear like that. Not here. Not like this. The first officers on scene don't say much. They don't need to. The air does the talking for them, thick with something wrong, something unfinished. They move slowly, deliberately, as if rushing might disturb whatever invisible trace has been left behind. But there's almost nothing to disturb. The house is too clean, too still, like it's been waiting. Neighbors gather in loose clusters, arms folded, voices low but urgent. Someone mentions a strange car seen earlier that week. Someone else swears they heard an argument days before, though they can't recall the words. Details surface and sink just as quickly, unreliable, shifting, each one a thread that leads nowhere. Within hours, the word spreads. Missing. By nightfall, it becomes something else. Suspicious. And then, almost without warning, the phrase that will follow this case for decades begins to take shape, whispered first, then printed, then embedded in the collective memory of a community that will never quite let it go. Cold case. But not yet. Not officially. Not in those early days when everything still feels possible, when detectives fan out across the city, knocking on doors, retracing steps, building timelines that stretch and twist and collapse under their own uncertainty. They map her last known movements with obsessive precision, who she spoke to, where she went, what she wore, as if enough detail might conjure her back into existence. It doesn't. Instead, the timeline fractures. Witnesses contradict each other. Surveillance footage, grainy, incomplete, offers glimpses but no answers. A figure in the background. A car that might match, or might not. Shadows that seem to move differently, depending on who's watching. And then there are the calls. Anonymous. Brief. Distorted. Each one hinting at knowledge no outsider should have. Each one ending before it reveals anything concrete, leaving behind only a deeper sense of unease, as if someone is watching the investigation unfold and choosing, deliberately, to stay just out of reach. Detectives chase every lead. They have to. It's what they do. But with every passing day, the leads thin out, stretch into speculation, then dissolve entirely, and what remains is a growing void where certainty should be. Days turn into weeks. Weeks into months. The case file grows thicker, heavier, filled with reports, interviews, photographs, each page a fragment of a story that refuses to come together. They revisit the house again and again, hoping something was missed, something overlooked in those first crucial hours, but the house gives them nothing. It remains exactly as it was, silent, composed, almost indifferent. And that's what unsettles them most. Because somewhere something happened. Something precise. Something controlled. Not chaos. Not impulse. Design. The kind of design that doesn't leave fingerprints. The kind that knows exactly how much to take and how much to leave behind. By the end of the first year, the headlines begin to change. The urgency fades, replaced by distance, by the slow drift of public attention toward newer, louder stories, but in that neighborhood, nothing really moves on. People lock their doors a little earlier. They watch unfamiliar cars a little longer. Conversations pause when certain names are mentioned. Because everyone feels it. The gap. The unanswered question hanging over everything like a storm that never quite breaks. And then, just when it seems like the case is slipping into that quiet, permanent category of unsolved, something surfaces. Not a breakthrough, not even close, but enough to reignite the tension, enough to remind everyone that whatever happened that night is still out there, still unresolved, still waiting. A witness comes forward. Late. Too late, some would argue. But not irrelevant. Never irrelevant. They describe a moment, brief, easily overlooked. A figure near the edge of the property, partially obscured, lingering just long enough to be noticed, but not long enough to be identified. The description is vague, frustratingly so, but it adds something the case didn't have before. Presence. Someone was there. Someone close. Closer than anyone realized. And suddenly, the narrative shifts again. Not random. Not distant. Intimate. Which makes it worse. Because if it's intimate, if it's someone within reach, within that small circle of trust and familiarity, then the implications ripple outward, touching everyone, implicating no one, creating a web of suspicion that tightens with every unanswered question. Detectives revisit old interviews. They listen more carefully this time. They notice pauses they missed before. Contradictions that seemed insignificant now feel deliberate. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the case begins to transform. Not solved. Not even close. But deeper. Darker. More complicated than anyone expected. And still no body. No definitive evidence. No resolution. Just a name. A date. And a growing certainty that the truth, whatever it is, has been buried far more carefully than anyone imagined. Years pass. The file is reassigned. Then reassigned again. New detectives bring fresh eyes, fresh theories, but they all run into the same wall. The same absence, the same carefully constructed void that refuses to yield. Technology improves. Forensics evolve. Old evidence is re-examined, tested, retested, analyzed under conditions that didn't exist in 1995, and for a moment, hope flickers again, fragile but persistent, the idea that maybe, just maybe, something was missed, something that can finally break the case open. But the results come back inconclusive. Again, and again, and again. Each time, the same conclusion. Not enough. Never enough. And that's how a case becomes truly cold. Not when it's forgotten, but when it refuses to move, when every path leads back to the same unanswered questions, when the absence becomes the defining feature of the investigation. Still, the story doesn't disappear. It lingers. In conversations. In local news retrospectives. In the quiet determination of the few who refuse to let it go. Because somewhere in that silence, in that carefully preserved emptiness, there is a truth. And truths have a way of resurfacing. Even after decades. Even when buried. Even when someone has spent years making sure they never come to light. And when they do, when that first crack appears, when that first real piece of evidence finally breaks through the surface, it doesn't arrive gently. It doesn't explain itself. It detonates. And nothing, absolutely nothing, remains the same after that. Because this wasn't just a disappearance. It was a story interrupted. A life cut out of its own narrative. And for 30 years, the ending has been missing. Until now. The first real crack doesn't come from a dramatic discovery, not from a hidden body or a sudden confession, but from something far quieter, far less cinematic, a box misfiled, overlooked, sitting for years in the back corner of an evidence room where time doesn't pass so much as it settles, layer upon layer of dust and forgotten intent, until someone new, someone who doesn't know the unwritten rules of what's considered dead, pulls it back into the light. Inside, nothing looks remarkable. Old reports. Photographs. A cassette tape sealed in plastic, labeled in hurried handwriting that has already begun to fade. It had been logged, cataloged, acknowledged, and then ignored because at the time it didn't seem to matter, didn't seem to fit, didn't align with the narrative investigators were chasing. But narratives change, especially when everything else fails. The detective who opens that box doesn't expect revelation. He expects repetition, the same dead ends, the same contradictions. But something about the tape holds his attention longer than it should, something about the fact that it was never fully processed, never enhanced, never revisited with the tools that now exist. Tools that didn't exist in 1995 when analog noise swallowed detail and subtlety was lost to static. He plays it once, then again, then a third time, this time with headphones, isolating the sound, pushing past the hiss, the distortion, the imperfections that once made it useless. And that's when he hears it. Not clearly, not cleanly, but undeniably. A voice. Not the victims. Not anyone officially recorded in the case file. A second voice, low, controlled, speaking just outside the range of what the original investigators could confidently identify, buried beneath background noise that now, decades later, can be peeled back, layer by layer, until what was once dismissed as interference begins to take shape as intention. The room changes when he realizes it. The air sharpens. Because if there was a second voice, if someone else was there in that moment, then everything shifts again. Timelines, assumptions, alibis, all of it becomes unstable. The tape is sent for enhancement. Digital reconstruction. Audio isolation. Processes that take days, then weeks, each iteration refining the sound just enough to push it closer to comprehension without ever fully crossing that line into certainty. But it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be enough. And it is. A phrase emerges. Fragmented. Incomplete. But loaded. You shouldn't have. That's all. For words, or something close to them, stretched and distorted by time, but consistent across every enhancement, every attempt to dismiss it as artifact or coincidence. You shouldn't have. Not a threat. Not exactly. More like a reaction. An acknowledgement of something already done. Something irreversible. And suddenly, the case isn't just about disappearance anymore. It's about confrontation. About a moment where two people occupied the same space, where something was said that shouldn't have been said, or discovered that shouldn't have been discovered. And from that moment, the narrative begins to rebuild itself. Not cleanly, not confidently, but with direction. Detectives go back, again, to the original interviews, this time with a different question in mind, a different lens through which to interpret every hesitation, every inconsistency. Who knew her well enough to speak like that? Who would have reason to say those words? Who had something to lose? The list is not long. It never is. And that's what makes it dangerous. Because the closer the circle, the heavier the implications. Friends, colleagues, family, names that have been cleared before, dismissed, filed away as cooperative, as uninvolved, as safe. Now, none of them feel entirely safe. The community feels it too. The shift. The reopening of something that was never fully closed. Old rumors resurface, sharper this time, less restrained by time and distance. People remember things differently when they believe there's a chance those memories might finally matter. A neighbor recalls a light on at an unusual hour. A coworker mentions a conversation that seemed insignificant at the time, but now feels loaded with meaning. A friend admits, reluctantly, that there had been tension, not dramatic, not explosive, but present, lingering beneath the surface of what everyone else saw as normal. And slowly, piece by piece, the image sharpens. Not enough to see the full picture, but enough to recognize its outline. There was a secret, something she knew, something she wasn't supposed to know, and someone else knew that she knew. That's the pivot. That's the moment everything tilts. Because secrets don't create disappearances on their own. People do. People with motive. People with fear. People with something at stake that feels bigger than the consequences of being caught. The investigation narrows. Not publicly. Not yet. But internally, the focus tightens around a handful of individuals whose timelines don't quite align, whose statements shift subtly between interviews, whose proximity to the victim is no longer just coincidence. Surveillance footage is reanalyzed. Old phone records, once too complex, too fragmented, are reconstructed with modern algorithms that can trace patterns where none were visible before. Calls made. Calls not made. Gaps in communication that suggest more than absence, they suggest intention. And then another detail surfaces. Small. Almost dismissible. A receipt. Time-stamped. Recovered years ago but never fully contextualized, because at the time, it didn't contradict anything important. Now it does. Now it places someone exactly where they said they weren't. Not far. Not dramatically out of place. But close enough to matter. Close enough to raise a question that can't be ignored anymore. Why lie? Why shift something so small unless the truth of it leads somewhere dangerous? The detectives don't confront immediately. They watch. They build. Because after 30 years, the case doesn't need another misstep. It needs precision, patience, pressure applied slowly, deliberately, until something gives. And something always gives. Because no one carries a secret like that forever without it leaking out in ways they can't control. In tone, in memory, in the subtle inconsistencies that accumulate over time until they form a pattern too clear to ignore. The suspect, not officially named, not yet, begins to feel it. The renewed attention. The quiet questions. The sense that something long buried is being unearthed piece by piece. And pressure does strange things to people. It distorts. It amplifies. It reveals. Friends notice a change. A restlessness. An edge that wasn't there before. Small things at first, impatience, distraction, but growing, building, until it becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Because somewhere, deep beneath years of silence and carefully maintained normalcy, there is a memory that hasn't faded. A moment that replays. A voice that echoes. You shouldn't have. And with every new development, every reconstructed detail, that moment gets closer to the surface. Closer to being seen. Closer to being understood. But still not fully exposed. Not yet. Because the truth, when it finally emerges, doesn't come in fragments. It comes all at once. And when it does, it doesn't just answer questions. It creates new ones. More unsettling. More dangerous. Because solving a cold case doesn't always bring closure. Sometimes, it reveals something far worse than uncertainty. Something deliberate. Something calculated. Something that has been waiting silently, for decades, for the exact moment when it can no longer stay hidden. And that moment is coming. Closer than anyone realizes. The interrogation room doesn't feel like a room anymore when the case finally reaches it again. It feels like a pressure chamber sealed against time, where every breath is measured, every silence weighted, and every question is less about information than erosion, because after 30 years the truth is rarely hidden in answers. It's hidden in the gaps between them. The suspect sits across from investigators who were not even part of the original timeline in 1995, younger faces holding older questions, carrying a case file that has outlived careers, outlived memories, outlived the version of the world in which it was first opened. And still, the name of the victim hangs in the air like a static charge that never fully dissipates. At first, everything is controlled. Polite denials. Carefully structured recollections. The language of someone who has rehearsed memory so many times it no longer feels like memory at all, but performance. I don't remember. That's not how it happened. I wasn't there. Each sentence delivered with a calm that is almost convincing, almost stable enough to withstand scrutiny, almost. But almost is where cold cases begin to fracture again. Because investigators aren't listening to what is said. They are listening to what slips. A pause that lingers half a second too long. A correction that arrives too quickly. A detail added where none was needed. The body betrays what the voice tries to conceal. Outside the room, the tape plays again. The enhanced recording from part 2, the fragmented voice hovering in static. You shouldn't have. It has become more than evidence now. It has become a key. And keys are meant to unlock something. Inside the room, the questioning shifts. Not aggressive. Not loud. Precise. They don't accuse. They align facts. They place small contradictions side by side, letting them speak to each other until silence becomes uncomfortable, until certainty begins to tilt. You were within 10 minutes of her location that night. I told you I wasn't. Your phone places you there. That's not accurate. It is your device. A pause. Longer this time. Not empty. Heavier. Because technology doesn't forget the way people do. And in a case like this, technology becomes the witness that never ages, never changes its story, never softens its edges for comfort. The suspect shifts slightly in the chair. A subtle movement. But now everything is being watched. Every gesture, every micro-expression, every breath that doesn't match the narrative being constructed. And slowly, something begins to emerge. Not confession yet, not truth, but strain. The kind of strain that appears when memory and reality are forced into the same space and refuse to align. Outside the interrogation room, the investigative team lays out a timeline on a glass board, layering years like sediment. 1995, 1996, 2000, 2010, each layer revealing how long the silence has been maintained, how many opportunities there were for correction, confession, collapse. And at the center of it all is a single unresolved point. The night she disappeared. The moment everything changes. The suspect is asked again. This time softer. Not a challenge. An invitation. What happened that night? And for the first time, there is no immediate answer. Only stillness. The kind that feels rehearsed, but is starting to break apart under its own weight. Because the problem with silence is that it is never truly empty. It fills itself with everything that was not said. Everything that was avoided. Everything that was buried because speaking it aloud would make it real again. And real things have consequences. The room's air conditioning hum becomes louder in the absence of speech, like the building itself is waiting for something to happen, like even the walls remember more than they should. The suspect looks down. Not at the detectives. Not at the file. At something smaller. Something internal. And for a moment, the investigators think they have it, the fracture point, the place where the narrative will finally give way. But then it doesn't. Not yet. Instead, the suspect says something unexpected. Not a denial. Not a confession. A deflection so precise it almost feels practiced. You don't understand what she had. That sentence changes the temperature in the room. Because it introduces something new. Motive. Not simple motive. Not the kind built on anger or impulse. Something more specific. Something tied to possession, knowledge, control. The kind of motive that doesn't explode outward, but tightens inward until it collapses everything around it. Investigators exchange a glance. This is the first real deviation from the defensive script. The first moment where something unplanned appears. They don't interrupt. They let it breathe. Because in cold cases, breathing space is where truth sometimes surfaces. But still, the suspect stops there. Refuses to continue. As if they've stepped too close to a ledge and realized how far the drop is. Outside, the case file grows heavier with annotations, new connections being drawn between old witnesses, revisited statements now reinterpreted under the shadow of this emerging detail. She had something, she knew something, something that made her dangerous in ways no one fully understood at the time. And suddenly, her disappearance stops looking like randomness. It stops looking like tragedy alone. It starts looking like reaction. Contained. Directed. Deliberate. But even now, even with pressure mounting, even with the digital reconstruction, the phone records, the contested timeline, there is still a missing piece that refuses to appear. The body. Or evidence of what happened after the last confirmed moment of contact. Because without that, everything remains suspended, theory, suspicion, implication, all hovering just above certainty, but never landing fully inside it. And that is where cold cases live. In suspension. In the space between what is known and what can be proven. But something is shifting now. Subtly. Irreversibly. Because the past is no longer being studied. It is being challenged. And when a case reaches that point, when silence is no longer stable, it begins to collapse under its own weight. The suspect finally looks up again. And what the investigators see this time is not control. Not confidence. Not denial. It is something thinner. Something fraying at the edges. The first visible sign that time, even 30 years of it, does not erase everything equally. Some things remain. Some things grow heavier. Some things wait. And eventually, they demand to be spoken aloud. Even if speaking them destroys everything that was built on silence. The moment the word, what she had, enters the record, the case stops behaving like a missing person investigation and starts behaving like something more dangerous. Because possessions don't vanish cleanly, and knowledge doesn't disappear without leaving fingerprints somewhere in someone's life. And now every thread in the timeline begins to tighten toward a center that has been hidden in plain sight for 30 years. Outside the interrogation room, the file is reopened again from the beginning, but it no longer feels like the beginning. It feels like excavation, like digging through layers of sand that were never meant to be disturbed, and each page now carries a different weight because context has changed, meaning has shifted, and details that once looked random now look intentional. A friend's statement from 1995 is pulled again. At the time, it was nothing, just background noise in a crowded investigation. She was stressed, lately said someone wouldn't drop it. That line had been marked as vague, unreliable, emotional distortion. Now it is underlined. Twice. Because wouldn't drop it is no longer vague. It is directional. It points toward persistence, toward pursuit, toward something ongoing that did not end when she disappeared. And suddenly, the victim is no longer only a victim in memory. She becomes a participant in something unfinished, something active, something that reached a breaking point. Inside the interrogation room, the suspect is asked again about that phrase. What did you mean, what she had? The answer does not come immediately. And when it does, it is not clean. It wasn't hers, the suspect says finally, voice lower now, less rehearsed. Not really, it belonged to someone else first. That sentence lands harder than any accusation so far, because it introduces a structure beneath the case that investigators had not fully considered. Not just motive, not just conflict, but transfer of information, of objects, of leverage. And leverage, in cold cases, is almost always what survives the longest. Because people can forget feelings. They cannot forget power. The room feels smaller now. Not physically, but conceptually, like the boundaries of the case itself are closing inward. A detective leans forward slightly. Something physical? A hesitation. A fraction of a nod that might not even be intentional. And that is enough. Because now the investigation shifts again, not toward personalities, not toward relationships, but toward objects. What was exchanged, what was seen, what was kept, what was never reported. Back in the evidence room, a second box is retrieved. This one had been labeled irrelevant in 1996. Personal effects, no evidentiary value. Inside, a small set of items recovered from her home during the initial search. Books, papers, a notebook that had been skimmed once and dismissed because nothing inside seemed actionable at the time. Now it is opened again, page by page, line by line, and then they find it. Not a confession, not a note, something worse in its subtlety. Repeated references, names written and crossed out, dates that do not match official timelines, and in the margins, fragments of sentences that feel unfinished, interrupted mid-thought, as if she had been documenting something while trying not to be seen documenting it. One line stands out. If anything happens, it started when The rest is gone, torn or erased or never finished. But the implication is immediate. She knew, or she was close enough to knowing that she felt the need to record it. And that changes everything again. Because now she is not just a passive disappearance. She is a point of convergence. Someone who was circling something dangerous enough to require caution, and precise enough to leave traces only in fragments. The interrogation resumes, but the dynamic has shifted. The suspect is no longer entirely in control of the rhythm. They are reacting now, adjusting, correcting less carefully. The defense is thinning. Investigators press gently, but relentlessly, threading the notebook evidence into the conversation. There were notes, one says, sliding a photocopy across the table, her handwriting. You recognize this? A pause, a flicker, and then something breaks through the surface. Not full recognition, but discomfort sharp enough to be visible. That shouldn't exist, the suspect says quietly. Not a denial, a reaction, a correction of reality. And that is the first moment where certainty begins to lean toward something irreversible. Because in investigations like this, people don't usually deny evidence exists. They deny its meaning, unless its existence alone is dangerous. Outside, the theory board expands again. Now it is no longer just missing person. It is networked. Names are connected with lines that did not exist yesterday. Relationships are reinterpreted. Interactions reweighted. And at the center of it all, the victim is no longer isolated. She is connected. To people. To events. To something that predates her disappearance. And that raises the question no one wants to ask too loudly. Was she targeted because she was alone? Or because she wasn't? Back in the room, the suspect shifts again. A small movement. But now it reads differently. Less composure. More calculation. Because something is happening internally. Not collapse, not yet, but the recognition that the investigation is no longer guessing. It is converging. Because it reduces escape routes. It eliminates ambiguity. It forces edges where before there were shadows. A detective asks one final question before the next silence settles. Who else knew about it? This time, the suspect doesn't answer immediately. And in that delay, something new enters the room. Not information. Not confession. Fear. Subtle, but present. Because fear, after 30 years, usually means one thing. The past is no longer safely in the past. It is moving again. And it is moving closer than expected. The word fear doesn't need to be spoken aloud in the room for everyone to recognize it, because fear in a long, cold case doesn't behave like panic. It behaves like hesitation that arrives too late, like control that begins to slip in measurable increments. And once it appears, it becomes the loudest thing in the silence. The suspect doesn't answer the last question. Not immediately. Not cleanly. Instead, there is a shift, almost imperceptible. In posture, in breathing, in the way attention no longer holds steady on the detectives, but drifts for the first time toward the door, toward escape routes that don't physically exist in the geometry of the room, but exist psychologically in every human being who realizes the conversation has moved beyond their prepared boundaries. Outside, the investigation accelerates without permission. Old witnesses are revisited, but this time the questions are different. Not what did you see, but what did you ignore? And that difference changes everything, because memory is not just observation, it is editing, and editing always leaves traces if you know where to look. A co-worker from 1995 is brought in again. At first, they resist. Same answers. Same distancing language. But then a detail surfaces, almost unwillingly. She used to ask questions about files that weren't hers, said she found inconsistencies. That sentence lands like a new structure being built inside the case file, because inconsistencies imply systems, and systems imply something organized enough to survive scrutiny, something that doesn't behave like personal conflict alone. It behaves like exposure. Inside the interrogation room, the suspect finally speaks again, but the tone has changed. Lower. Slower. As if every word now has to pass through internal approval before leaving the mouth. You're looking at it wrong, the suspect says, and for the first time there is something close to urgency beneath the restraint. It wasn't about her not originally. That phrase, not originally, becomes an anchor, because it implies a timeline before the timeline. A cause before the cause investigators believed they were pursuing. And that shifts the entire gravity of the case again. A detective leans in. Start from the beginning. But beginnings are dangerous in cases like this, because beginnings are where stories split into versions, and versions are where truth becomes contested territory. The suspect exhales. A long pause. Then, she wasn't supposed to see it. No elaboration. No context. But the sentence carries weight because it doesn't sound like invention. It sounds like repetition. Like something said before. Many times before. And repetition is what creates consistency, even in lies. The investigation team outside reacts instantly, not with noise, but with movement. Folders opened, timelines adjusted, connections redrawn, because she saw it reframes everything again. Not disappearance. Not conflict. Exposure. And exposure is the most dangerous catalyst in any long-running case. A new angle emerges almost immediately. Digital records from the mid-90s are reprocessed, early archived databases, poorly indexed logs, fragmented systems that were never meant to interact with modern forensic tools. What was once inaccessible now begins to align. Patterns emerge. Shared timestamps. Overlapping locations. Names that appear in proximity without official association. And then a gap. A deliberate absence. A record that should exist but does not. Deleted. Or never entered. Either possibility carries implications too large to ignore. Inside the room, the suspect is asked about that gap. About missing documentation. About systems that don't reconcile. And this time, there is no immediate deflection. Only silence. And in that silence, something shifts again. Not toward confession, but toward acknowledgement that the conversation is no longer something they can fully control. You don't understand what happens when certain things get recorded, the suspect finally says. And that sentence changes the shape of the case entirely. Because now it is not about individuals alone. It is about mechanisms, about what is allowed to be seen, and what is erased before it can become real. Outside, a retired officer is contacted, one who originally worked the case in 1995. The conversation is hesitant at first, fragmented by time and distance, but when the victim's name is mentioned, something changes in tone. A pause. A recognition that isn't verbalized immediately. Then, there were things we were told not to push. That is the first explicit confirmation of external pressure. Not conspiracy. Not speculation. Pressure. And pressure changes everything because it introduces intention beyond the immediate suspects. It suggests containment, management, control over narrative at an institutional level. The case file suddenly feels heavier than it did before, not because new evidence has been added, but because old evidence has been reinterpreted under a completely different framework. Inside the interrogation room, the suspect hears the question that follows, about influence, about interference, about who knew what and when, and for the first time, there is a visible internal conflict between continuing silence and the collapse that silence is beginning to require. Because silence is no longer protective. It is now compressive, and compression always leads to fracture. A final attempt at control appears. Not denial, not deflection, a warning embedded inside a statement. If this goes further, you won't be able to undo it. But warnings only work when they still hold authority. And authority, in this room, has already started to erode. Because 30 years of unanswered questions have created something stronger than fear. They have created momentum. And momentum, once it reaches a certain point, does not stop for permission. It continues until it hits something solid, or until the thing holding the silence finally breaks. And now, for the first time, it feels like the case is no longer waiting for answers. It is approaching them. The warning doesn't land like a threat anymore. It lands like evidence of a system that once had weight, authority, and reach, but now exists only as residue in the mouths of people who remember being told to stay quiet. And in cold cases, residue is often more revealing than confession because it points not only to what happened, but to what was protected. Inside the interrogation room, the silence after the warning stretches longer than any answer so far, not empty but crowded, filled with implications that no one is willing to name outright yet, because naming them would turn suspicion into structure, and structure is what transforms a case from mystery into accountability. The suspect finally looks up again. But something has changed. Not defiance. Not control. Fatigue. The kind that doesn't come from sleep deprivation, but from sustained containment. From holding together a version of events that has been reinforced for decades until the effort of maintaining it becomes heavier than the truth it hides. Outside, the investigative team shifts strategy. They stop asking, what happened that night, in isolation, and begin reconstructing the week around it, because events rarely rupture in a single moment. They accumulate pressure until the rupture feels sudden only in hindsight. Phone records are expanded again. Not just calls made, but calls attempted. Missed connections. Short bursts of communication that suggest hesitation, avoidance, interruption. And then a pattern begins to emerge that had been invisible before because no one was looking for it. 3 days before the disappearance, there is a cluster of activity tied to the victim's number. Repeated contact attempts to one specific individual, escalating in frequency, then stopping abruptly. Not blocked. Not continued. Just stopped. That stop point becomes a focal fracture in the timeline, because stops without explanation are rarely neutral. Inside the interrogation room, the suspect is shown the reconstructed timeline, not as accusation, as fact. The detective places the printed records on the table, sliding them forward without emphasis, allowing the weight of them to speak first. You were contacted multiple times, the detective says, in the days before she disappeared. A pause. Then, no response. The suspect's eyes track the paper without touching it. And for the first time, the response is not immediate denial. It wasn't supposed to escalate, the suspect says quietly. That phrase changes the temperature again, because escalation implies expectation, planning, a boundary that was believed to be stable until it wasn't. And in that shift, the case begins to align itself around a different center. Not disappearance as an isolated act, but disappearance as outcome. The investigation widens its lens again, pulling in peripheral contacts, secondary connections, indirect associations that had previously been dismissed as noise. A former colleague, a shared contact, a recurring name appearing in multiple contexts, but never prominently enough to trigger attention in earlier phases of the investigation. Now it becomes a node, and nodes are how networks are revealed. Outside, analysts begin mapping interactions visually, and for the first time, the case stops looking like a linear story and starts looking like a structure. Interconnected, layered, with pressure points distributed across time rather than concentrated in a single moment. Inside the room, the suspect notices the shift in tone. The questioning is no longer exploratory. It is convergent. Everything is narrowing. And narrowing cases are the most dangerous kind for someone holding on to controlled silence, because they eliminate ambiguity faster than humans can adapt. A new question is introduced. Simple. Direct. What did she find? The suspect hesitates. Longer than before. And in that hesitation, something breaks slightly. Not fully, not catastrophically, but enough to be visible. And then, she wasn't supposed to access those records. Records again. Systems again. Not personal conflict, but institutional proximity. The implication is no longer subtle. Whatever the victim discovered, it was not isolated information. It was part of something structured enough to be protected and sensitive enough to be concealed. The detectives exchange a glance. This is no longer just a missing person's cold case. A case where disappearance may have been an endpoint rather than an event. Outside, the retired officer from 1995 is contacted again, and this time the conversation carries less hesitation, more fatigue, like someone finally speaking after years of rehearsed silence. There were internal discussions, the officer admits, about keeping certain findings out of official circulation. The phrase internal discussions becomes its own category of evidence, because it suggests awareness, decision-making, a boundary drawn deliberately. And once boundaries like that are acknowledged, every gap in the record becomes suspect. Inside the interrogation room, the suspect hears a different kind of pressure now, not from questions, but from the accumulation of everything outside the room pressing inward. The detective asks again, softer this time, almost deliberately calm. What did she access? And for the first time, the suspect doesn't redirect, doesn't deflect. Instead, there is a long pause, and when the answer comes, it is fragmented. Something that wasn't supposed to be connected. That sentence is not a confession, but it is a fracture point, because connected implies multiple entities, multiple layers, something that cannot exist in isolation. And suddenly, the victim is no longer at the center of a simple disappearance. She is at the intersection of something larger, something that required control, containment, and removal. The realization does not arrive dramatically. It arrives quietly, like pressure equalizing in a sealed space just before a rupture. And everyone in the investigation feels it at the same time. The case is no longer about finding out what happened. It is about uncovering why it was allowed to remain hidden for so long. And that answer, once it begins to surface, will not stay contained. The word connected doesn't leave the room. It hangs there instead, suspended like something unfinished, because in investigations that stretch across decades, language is never just description. It is exposure, and exposure has a way of expanding far beyond the intention of the person who spoke it. Inside the interrogation room, the suspect now speaks less like someone defending a position, and more like someone trying to control the shape of what can still be said without collapsing everything at once, because once a narrative starts to fracture at its core, every additional detail becomes a risk. Outside, the case file is no longer treated as a single document. It has become a system. Multiple teams are now working in parallel, re-examining the same timeline from different angles: financial records, communications, personnel logs, archived incident reports. Not because they expect a single smoking gun, but because patterns rarely appear in isolation. And patterns, once recognized, tend to multiply. A financial analyst flags something subtle. Not illegal on its own. Not even unusual in isolation. But recurring. Small transfers, indirect routes, timing that aligns too precisely with key moments in the victim's last known days of activity. At first, it is labeled coincidence. Then coincidence becomes correlation. And correlation becomes something harder to ignore. Inside the interrogation room, the detective introduces the concept carefully. Not accusation, just structure. There were movements around you, he says, sliding a new set of documents across the table, financial, indirect, but consistent with the timeline. The suspect doesn't look at them immediately, and that delay is no longer neutral. It is measured, controlled, like someone deciding how much reality they are willing to acknowledge at once. Finally, "You're looking at fragments," the suspect says. The detective responds immediately. So complete the picture. That exchange lands differently than before, because now both sides understand that the picture is not missing pieces by accident. It is missing them by design, or at least by consequence of something that was never meant to be reconstructed later. Outside, another layer emerges. A communications archive from a defunct system, partially preserved, partially corrupted, is recovered and reconstructed using modern forensic software. Within it, a series of internal messages appear. Not dramatic, not explicit, but carefully worded. Too carefully worded. They reference sensitivity, containment, risk exposure, and non-escalation protocols, language that belongs less to personal relationships and more to institutional handling of information that is considered volatile. And suddenly, the case stops being interpreted through the lens of individual motive alone. It becomes procedural. Inside the room, the suspect is shown excerpts. Not all at once, piece by piece. Enough to establish context without overwhelming, enough to allow reaction to emerge naturally rather than defensively. The suspect reads silently. And for the first time, the mask doesn't fully break, but it shifts. A subtle tightening around the eyes. A recognition that is not surprise, but inevitability. This wasn't supposed to resurface, the suspect says. That sentence is different from earlier statements. It is not denial. It is acknowledgement of fragility, of systems built on suppression that assume permanence. And permanence, in cold cases, is always an illusion. The detective leans forward slightly. Who decided that? A pause. Long enough that it begins to feel like refusal. But then, not me. It is the closest thing to deflection that still carries implication. Because not me doesn't answer the question. It only shifts the center of gravity elsewhere. Outside, investigators begin tracing organizational layers more aggressively. Not just individuals, but hierarchies. Not just actions, but authorization chains. Because if something was suppressed, it means someone had the ability to suppress it, and that ability does not exist in isolation. It exists within structure. And structure leaves trails even when individuals do not. A retired records officer is brought in for questioning. At first hesitant, careful. But as the documents are laid out, old logs, authorization stamps, archival access records, the hesitation shifts into something more complicated. Recognition and discomfort. There were flags, the officer admits, things marked for restricted visibility. Not criminal, just sensitive. Sensitive to whom? The detective asks. A pause. Then, above my clearance. That phrase changes the entire atmosphere of the investigation again, because clearance levels imply institutional hierarchy, and hierarchy implies controlled knowledge distribution. Which means the victim was not simply discovering something dangerous. She was moving through layers she was not meant to access. Inside the interrogation room, the suspect finally reacts more directly. You don't understand what happens when people start pulling at things they don't see the full shape of, they say, voice tightening slightly. It doesn't matter intent. It matters exposure. And now the language shifts again, from personal involvement to systemic consequence. Exposure becomes the threat. Not action. Not violence. Knowledge itself. Outside, the investigative board is rebuilt yet again. But this time, it no longer resembles a timeline. It resembles a network of controlled boundaries, access points, restricted zones, points where information was allowed to pass and points where it was deliberately stopped. And in the center of it all, the victim is no longer framed as someone who vanished. She is reframed as someone who crossed thresholds. Multiple thresholds. Without authorization. Without protection. And in systems built on containment, crossing thresholds is not treated as curiosity. It is treated as breach. Inside the room, silence returns again. But it is different now. It is no longer uncertainty. It is compression. Everything that has been revealed is pressing inward toward a final point of collapse or disclosure. The detective asks one final question before the next shift. What happens when someone sees too much? The suspect doesn't answer immediately. But this time, the silence is not avoidance. It is calculation. Because somewhere between the questions, the documents, the reconstructed systems, and the decades of delay, the truth has stopped being abstract. It has become unavoidable. And whatever answer comes next will not just explain the past. It will define what has been hidden inside it all along. And that is the moment the case begins to tip toward its final shape. The question, what happens when someone sees too much, doesn't receive an answer immediately. Because in cases like this, answers are not withheld out of mystery. They are withheld out of structure, as if speaking them aloud completes a circuit that was never meant to be closed. Inside the interrogation room, the suspect finally leans back slightly, not in relaxation, but in a recalibration of control, like someone recognizing that the conversation has moved beyond containment and into exposure, and now every word has consequences that extend far beyond the room itself. Outside, the investigation is no longer moving in straight lines. It is moving in layers. Each new discovery doesn't replace the old narrative. It sits on top of it, reinterpreting everything beneath it, like geological strata where pressure has transformed simple events into something denser, more compressed, more resistant to easy explanation. A forensic review of archived communications yields another anomaly. A single thread of internal coordination messages from the weeks surrounding the disappearance, partially redacted, partially preserved, referencing external sensitivity alignment and limitation of investigative scope. At first, analysts assume bureaucratic language. Then they notice timing. Every mention aligns with key investigative milestones from 1995, moments when certain leads were abruptly deprioritized, when certain interviews were not pursued further, when certain evidence was logged but not followed up. Not erased. Redirected. Inside the interrogation room, the detective places another document on the table. No theatrics. No emphasis. Just placement. Because at this stage, pressure comes from accumulation, not intensity. You said it wasn't just personal, he says, so explain what system requires that level of coordination. The suspect looks at the document without touching it. And for the first time, there is visible conflict between what can be said and what cannot be contained anymore. It's not something you can isolate, the suspect replies finally. That sentence is critical. Because isolation is what investigations rely on. And the moment something cannot be isolated, it becomes systemic by definition. Outside, a second retired investigator is located, someone who worked briefly on administrative review during the late stages of the original case. Their recollection is fragmented, but consistent in tone. There were discussions about limiting public exposure, they admit, not because of danger but because of implications. Implications of what? The current investigator asks. A long pause. Then, of who might be connected. That phrase, might be connected, reintroduces uncertainty, but in a different form than before. Not uncertainty about the crime. Uncertainty about reach. Inside the room, the suspect finally reacts to the cumulative weight of the reconstructed record. Not with denial. Not with deflection. But with something closer to resignation. You keep thinking there's a single moment, they say quietly. A single decision, but that's not how it worked. The detective doesn't interrupt. And that silence is intentional now. Because interruptions break momentum, and momentum is what forces hidden structures to reveal themselves. The suspect continues. She wasn't the first to notice inconsistencies. That line lands harder than any previous statement. Because it expands the victim's role retroactively. She is no longer an isolated anomaly. She is part of a sequence. A pattern, and patterns imply repetition, which implies precedent. Outside, the investigative board changes again. Names that were once peripheral are now connected in sequence, forming a chain of overlapping access points, overlapping awareness, overlapping silence. Not everyone knew everything, but enough people knew enough. And that distribution of partial knowledge creates something more stable than secrecy, compartmentalization. Inside the room, the detective presses carefully. How many? The suspect exhales, not immediately answering. Because numbers are dangerous in this context. Numbers define scale, and scale transforms implication into accountability. Finally, enough that stopping it wasn't simple. That sentence reframes everything again. Because not simple is not the same as impossible. It is the language of systems that continue because intervention would require too much disruption, too much visibility, too much risk. Outside, the forensic analyst reviewing archived metadata finds something else. A gap in oversight logs. Not a missing file, but a missing pattern of oversight itself. Periods where review cycles did not occur, where auditing timestamps are absent or inconsistent. It is subtle, almost invisible. But once identified, it becomes impossible to ignore. Because absence of oversight is itself a form of structure. Inside the interrogation room, the air feels different now. Not heavier, more concentrated. As if every word spoken in the last hour has compressed the space between truth and explanation until there is very little room left between them. The detective asks the next question slowly. Was she removed because of what she knew? The suspect does not answer immediately. And this pause is no longer about resistance. It is about threshold. Because some answers, once spoken, cannot be walked back into ambiguity. And finally, in a voice that is no longer defensive but carefully controlled. It wasn't about removing her, the suspect says. It was about stopping what she could trigger. That distinction changes everything, because it shifts intent from personal to procedural, from emotional to systemic, from reaction to prevention. Outside, the investigative team falls silent for a moment as the implication settles across the entire case structure. Because prevention implies foresight, and foresight implies awareness before the event occurred, which means this was never just about a disappearance. It was about managing a risk that had already been identified before it reached its conclusion. Inside the room, no one speaks for several seconds. Not because there is nothing left to say, but because the next layer of truth is now visible on the edge of articulation. And once it is spoken, the case will no longer be about what happened in 1995. It will be about what was already in motion long before anyone realized it had begun. The phrase, "what she could trigger," doesn't echo in the room the way earlier revelations did. It settles instead, like something that doesn't want to move anymore, because once a case shifts from event to consequence, every assumption about randomness collapses under the weight of design. Inside the interrogation room, the suspect no longer resists the rhythm of questioning in the same way, but neither do they fully surrender to it. Instead, they occupy a narrow space between disclosure and containment, as if each sentence is being weighed against outcomes that extend far beyond the present conversation. Outside, the investigation is no longer assembling facts. It is reconstructing intent. And intent is always harder to prove, but easier to feel once the pattern becomes visible. A new layer of analysis is introduced from the digital forensic team. They have been reconstructing legacy system logs from fragmented backups, not just communications but access behavior. Who viewed what, when, and how frequently certain restricted files were accessed before suddenly being sealed or migrated out of active circulation. What emerges is not a single breach, but a pattern of proximity. Multiple users, multiple points of contact, but one consistent subject area being accessed repeatedly in the weeks before the disappearance. Not openly, not officially, but persistently. Inside the room, the detective places another document down. This time, he does not speak immediately. He lets the suspect see the pattern first, because patterns are more persuasive than accusations. And after a long pause, the suspect finally speaks without being prompted. "You're mapping it like it's linear," they say, voice quieter now. But it wasn't linear. It was layered. Controlled access. Partial visibility. The word controlled lands heavily, because control implies structure maintained over time, not spontaneous reaction. Outside, the investigative team begins isolating a specific subset of individuals who had overlapping access privileges during the relevant period. Not just those directly involved in the victim's life, but those positioned around information pathways. IT administrators, records supervisors, mid-level compliance officers, people who rarely appear in narratives, but often define what narratives are allowed to exist. Inside the interrogation room, the suspect is asked again. Who initiated the containment? The question is different now. Not about actions, about origin. And that shift matters, because origin questions remove ambiguity about responsibility distribution. The suspect hesitates longer than before, not because they are avoiding the answer, but because the answer is structurally complicated. Finally, it didn't start with one person. That statement reframes everything again, because it dissolves the idea of a singular antagonist and replaces it with distributed responsibility, a system that self-stabilizes through multiple points of reinforcement. Outside, the forensic reconstruction team finds something critical. A sequence of archived policy updates from the mid-90s that correlate suspiciously with the timeline of the victim's escalating activity. On paper, they are administrative adjustments. In context, they align too precisely with investigative developments to be coincidental. Scope limitations, review restrictions, access reclassification protocols, each one individually explainable. Together, they form a framework of containment. Inside the interrogation room, the detective presses forward, but the tone is no longer purely investigative. It is interpretive. So she wasn't just observing something, he says. She was moving inside a system that was actively adjusting around her. The suspect doesn't deny it. And that absence of denial is more significant than any admission. Because in long investigations, confirmation often arrives not through what is said, but through what is no longer contested. Outside, another fragment surfaces. A partially recovered audio log from a secondary line, not directly tied to the victim, but linked to one of the peripheral individuals identified earlier in the network mapping. The recording is incomplete, but one segment stands out. A distorted exchange referencing containment thresholds and risk exposure escalation, terminology that no longer reads as metaphorical. Inside the room, the suspect listens as the detective references it. And for the first time, there is visible strain not just in expression, but in timing. The rhythm of responses begins to falter. You're pulling fragments from different layers, the suspect says. You're going to misinterpret them if you force them into one narrative. But that defense itself reveals something, because it acknowledges fragmentation. And fragmentation only exists where integration was intentionally avoided. The detective leans forward slightly. Then help us understand the layers. A long silence follows. Not empty, dense, because what is being asked is no longer about memory. It is about permission to articulate something that has been contained for too long. Finally, the suspect speaks. There were thresholds she crossed that were already marked. That sentence changes the direction again, because marked thresholds implies prior identification of risk zones, not accidental discovery, not unexpected exposure, predefined boundaries. Outside, the investigative board is now redrawn again, but this time it is not a timeline. It is a map of constraints: what was allowed, what was restricted, what was observed, what was redirected. And at the center is a growing realization that the victim's disappearance may not have been a singular act of violence or opportunistic crime, but a response mechanism within a larger, controlled environment. Inside the room, the air feels heavier not because of emotion, but because of convergence. Everything is beginning to point toward the same structural truth. And structural truths are the most difficult to dismantle because they are not held by one person. They are maintained collectively. The detective asks one final question before the next break in silence. When did it stop being about prevention? The suspect does not answer immediately. And in that pause, the distinction between past and present begins to blur, because the implication of the question is that it may not have stopped at all. It may have only changed form. And somewhere in that realization, the case stops feeling like history and starts feeling like something still in progress. The idea that something from 1995 might still be in progress doesn't land as a theory anymore. It lands as a structural possibility, because once a case is understood as a system of layered controls rather than a single event, time stops behaving like closure and starts behaving like continuity. Inside the interrogation room, the suspect sits differently now, not more relaxed, but more aligned with the reality that the conversation has moved beyond personal defense and into exposure of architecture. Invisible frameworks that governed what could be seen, what could be recorded, and what had to remain fragmented. Outside, the investigation is no longer expanding outward. It is tightening inward. Every new discovery reduces uncertainty, but increases pressure. A senior analyst reports a breakthrough in archived access chains. Not new data, but corrected reconstruction of old system logs that reveal a consistent pattern. Whenever the victim made contact with restricted information pathways, there was a corresponding administrative response within hours. Not days. Hours. Reclassification. Review suspension. Temporary access restrictions. Each one individually explainable. Together, they form something unmistakably responsive. Inside the room, the detective places a new printout on the table. This one is different. not communication, not witness testimony. A reconstructed system response timeline. You were aware of these adjustments, he says. It is not a question. The suspect doesn't deny immediately. And that delay is no longer hesitation. It is recognition that denial has become structurally impossible. I was aware of activity, the suspect finally says, carefully choosing words, not always the purpose behind it. That distinction is critical, because awareness without full understanding still implies proximity. And proximity, in this case, is the only currency that matters. Outside, investigators isolate a specific window of time, a narrow corridor of days where all significant events converge. The victim's escalating inquiries, the surge in restricted access activity, and the final abrupt cessation of her communications. Within that window, something else appears. A procedural anomaly. A gap in escalation tracking. Not missing data, but missing escalation logic, as if the system itself stopped acknowledging progression at a certain point. That is when the tone of the investigation changes again, from what happened to what was allowed to be processed. Inside the interrogation room, the suspect is asked, who had authority to override those processes? The question hangs longer than the others, because authority is no longer abstract. It is traceable, hierarchical, embedded in structures that still exist in modified form today. And finally, not individuals, the suspect says. That answer is immediate, but what follows is not. It was procedural authorization embedded across departments. That phrase shifts the entire case again, because it removes the idea of singular decision-making entirely and replaces it with distributed enforcement. A system where no single actor is fully responsible, yet outcomes are still produced consistently. Outside, the investigative team begins tracing legacy policy frameworks still in use, albeit updated and renamed, and discovers something unsettling. Portions of the original containment protocols were never fully retired. They were absorbed, modernized, integrated into newer compliance structures, which means the architecture that shaped the 1995 response may not be entirely historical. It may still be partially active in evolved form. Inside the room, the detective pauses before speaking again, because the next question is no longer about past events. It is about continuity. Does this system still exist? The suspect does not answer immediately. And that silence is different. It is not resistance. It is caution, because acknowledging continuity would collapse the boundary between past and present in a way that cannot be easily contained again. Finally, not in the way you're framing it, the suspect says. That answer is not reassuring. It is deflection refined into precision. Outside, the forensic team finds another anomaly, a pattern of administrative overrides that continue sporadically into later years, long after the original case went cold, suggesting that whatever structure existed did not end with the disappearance. It adapted. It diffused. It persisted in fragments. Inside the interrogation room, the detective leans forward again. And her disappearance, where does that fit? This time, the suspect exhales slowly, long enough that it feels like a boundary being crossed internally rather than externally. It fit where containment failed, the suspect says finally. That sentence changes everything again. Because failed containment is not accidental death, not random violence, not simple disappearance. It is outcome of system breakdown. Outside, the board is now almost unrecognizable from its original form. It no longer represents a case. It represents an ecosystem of control, adjustment, response, and suppression, a living structure that reacts to information flow rather than simply recording it. And at the center of that ecosystem is a single point of rupture, the moment the victim crossed from observation into exposure. Inside the room, silence returns once more. But this time, it feels different. Not like absence, like anticipation. Because both sides now understand that they are approaching the final layer of explanation, the point where systems stop being abstract and become accountable in ways that cannot remain distributed forever. The detective asks one final question before the next shift in momentum. What was the system protecting? The suspect looks down for a moment. And when they answer, it is no longer about individuals. It is no longer even about containment. It is about exposure at scale. And what happens when exposure becomes unavoidable? The question, what was the system protecting, doesn't trigger an immediate answer, because questions like that don't operate at the level of memory anymore. They operate at the level of permission, and permission is the last thing that survives long investigations, long after facts have been stripped of ambiguity and only consequences remain. Inside the interrogation room, the suspect's posture changes again, but not sharply, not dramatically. It is more like a gradual settling, as if the body has accepted that resistance is no longer the dominant force in the room and has shifted instead into calculation about how much truth can be released without triggering irreversible collapse elsewhere. Outside, the investigation has reached a point where new information no longer feels like discovery. It feels like exposure of something that was always present but structurally hidden. Analysts working through reconstructed archival systems identify a final layer of coordination logs, not direct communications, but meta-level administrative flags that indicate when certain categories of information were deemed non-integratable. The phrase itself is sterile, but its implication is not. Non-integratable means excluded from synthesis. Excluded from synthesis means deliberately prevented from forming a complete picture. And that means fragmentation was not a failure. It was design. Inside the interrogation room, the detective does not rush the moment. He lets the silence accumulate, because at this stage silence is no longer emptiness. It is pressure distribution, and pressure distribution always reveals weak points if held long enough. Finally, the suspect speaks. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a tone that suggests inevitability rather than confession. It was protecting visibility control, they say. That phrase lands differently than anything before it, because it reframes everything from containment of a single case into governance of perception itself. What could be seen, what could be connected, what could be allowed to form a coherent narrative. Outside, the investigative board shifts again, but this time there is hesitation in the room. Because visibility control is not a person, not even a system in the traditional sense. It is a principle embedded in layers of authorization, enforcement, and procedural fragmentation. It means the truth was never simply hidden. It was managed. Inside the room, the detective presses forward carefully. Managed from where? The suspect exhales, longer this time. And when they answer, the language changes again. Not softer, not harder, more abstract. From multiple points, they say. No single center. That answer removes the possibility of a singular origin point entirely. And with it, the last remaining assumption of linear accountability begins to dissolve. Outside, investigators discover something that reframes the entire historical arc of the case. Archived policy revisions show that visibility control protocols were not introduced in response to the victim's disappearance. They predated it. Not by months, by years, which means the system was already in place before she ever began interacting with it. Inside the interrogation room, that realization lands in silence before it is spoken. The detective doesn't need to say it out loud for the suspect to recognize it. And when he does speak, it is only to confirm direction, not interpretation. So she didn't discover something new, he says slowly. She entered something already structured. The suspect nods once. Barely. And that minimal acknowledgement carries more weight than any detailed explanation could, because it confirms the fundamental shift in understanding. The victim was not an accidental disruptor of a stable world. She was a variable introduced into a system already designed to respond to disruption. Outside, the investigative team begins to reconstruct the pre-1995 environment more aggressively, pulling in older records, older policy frameworks, older organizational structures that predate even the initial case file. What they find is not a single entity. It is a layered governance model for information exposure risk, a framework that classifies knowledge not by content alone, but by potential downstream impact. Inside the interrogation room, the detective asks the next question, but his tone has changed slightly. It is no longer purely investigative. It is almost reflective. And what happens when something classified as exposure risk can't be contained? The suspect pauses, long enough that the answer feels like it is being assembled rather than recalled. Then, it gets neutralized at the point of contact. The words are precise, clinical, and they reshape everything again. Because point of contact implies interception, not reaction. It implies systems designed to respond before outcomes fully manifest. Outside, that statement triggers a new phase of analysis. Investigators begin tracing not just what happened after the victim's disappearance, but what conditions preceded it that could indicate preemptive structuring of response pathways. And slowly, an uncomfortable pattern emerges. Every escalation the victim made toward restricted information domains was met with proportional system adjustments elsewhere. Not always directly, not always visibly, but consistently. Inside the interrogation room, the detective finally asks the question that has been forming since the beginning of this shift. Was her disappearance the first time that system failed? The suspect does not answer immediately. And in that pause, something changes in tone entirely. Because failure implies exception. And systems like the one being described do not tolerate exceptions easily. Finally, the suspect responds. It wasn't a failure, they say quietly. It was resolution. That word, resolution, reframes the entire case one last time in this stage. Because resolution is not collapse. It is completion within the logic of a system. Outside, the investigative board falls into near silence as analysts absorb the implication. The victim's disappearance is no longer interpreted as unresolved mystery within the system. It is interpreted as an outcome produced by it. Inside the room, the detective sits back slightly for the first time in several minutes. Not in defeat, not in acceptance, but in recognition that the case has reached a boundary where traditional investigative categories no longer fully apply. And somewhere in that realization, the final structural truth begins to form. Not yet spoken, but already visible. The case was never about finding a missing person. It was about understanding what kind of world can produce a disappearance that looks, from the outside, exactly like absence, while internally functioning as closure. The word resolution doesn't end the conversation, it rewrites it, because in cases like this language is never descriptive. It is operational, and once a term is accepted inside the logic of the investigation, it begins to reshape everything that came before it. Inside the interrogation room, the silence that follows is no longer the kind that holds uncertainty. It is the kind that sits after structure has been revealed, when every remaining question has already been indirectly answered, but no one is willing to compress those answers into a single sentence yet. Outside, the entire investigation feels like it has shifted weight. Not direction. Weight. As if the case file itself has become denser, more resistant to interpretation that treats it as a conventional disappearance. Analysts no longer argue about what happened. They argue about how it was allowed to be framed for so long as something else. A missing person. A cold case. A mystery. Now those labels feel inadequate, almost procedural misdirection in themselves, because what has emerged is not a singular act hidden in time, but a structured response to escalating exposure. Inside the room, the detective speaks more quietly than before. Not because he has less to say, but because the remaining questions carry a different kind of consequence. So she wasn't erased, he says slowly, she was processed. The suspect doesn't correct him, and that absence of correction becomes its own form of confirmation. Outside, the investigative board is no longer expanded. It is stabilized. Lines stop being added. They start being consolidated. Multiple pathways of interpretation collapse into fewer, heavier conclusions. And in that consolidation, something uncomfortable becomes visible. The victim's disappearance is not positioned at the center of randomness, but at the intersection of controlled response, procedural containment, and distributed authorization. Inside the interrogation room, the suspect finally speaks again, but the tone has changed for the last time. Not defensive, not cautious, detached. You keep trying to locate responsibility in a single place, they say, but the structure doesn't allow that. It was never built for that. The detective looks at them for a long moment, and then asks the final question, not as an accusation, not even as investigation, but as recognition of the only remaining unknown that still matters. Then what is left? A pause. Not theatrical. Not uncertain. Final. And the suspect answers. Only the way it stayed hidden. Outside, that sentence lands across the entire investigation like a closing layer being placed over exposed structure. Because once the mechanism of concealment is understood, the original question, what happened to her, no longer stands alone. It is replaced by something larger. How many times had it happened before recognition? How many similar cases were never labeled as such? How many disappearances were already interpreted through systems designed to absorb them without acknowledgement? Inside the room, there is no dramatic confession. No final revelation. Only alignment. The detective closes the file slowly. Not because the case is solved in the traditional sense, but because it has reached the point where additional questioning no longer changes its shape. The suspect remains seated, no longer resisting, no longer explaining, as if everything that needed to be transferred has already been transferred. And in that stillness, the final realization settles fully. The case was never just about one disappearance in 1995. It was about a framework that decides how disappearances are understood, recorded, and ultimately absorbed. A system where closure doesn't always mean answers. Sometimes it means containment. And sometimes the most unsettling part is not what was hidden, but how naturally it stayed that way. The file is closed, but nothing about the case feels finished, because closure in investigations like this is never a clean line. It is a managed silence, a procedural ending that exists on paper while the structure it exposed continues to exist underneath it, unchanged in form, even if altered in visibility. Inside the interrogation room, the suspect is no longer being questioned. They are simply present. And that presence feels different now, as if the role they occupied in the investigation has already been completed, leaving behind only the afterimage of testimony rather than testimony itself. Outside, the investigative team disperses slowly, not in frustration, not in defeat, but in a kind of quiet recalibration, because everyone understands, even if they do not say it aloud, that what they uncovered cannot be fully contained within a single case summary or prosecution outcome. It exists at a different scale, a structural scale, a scale that does not conclude with arrests or verdicts, a scale that continues to operate even after attention moves elsewhere. The board is dismantled, connections erased, documents archived, but no one in the room mistakes that for resolution. It is only relocation, shifting the weight of understanding into storage, where it can no longer actively reshape decisions, but cannot be fully forgotten either. Inside the room, the detective stands for a moment before leaving. He looks at the suspect, not for answers, but for confirmation that nothing further is required from either side. There is none offered, not because it is withheld, but because everything that could be said has already been absorbed into a framework that no longer requires speech. Outside, the building feels quieter than it did before the case reopened. Not empty, just normalized again, as if something intense passed through it and left no visible trace, except in those who experienced it directly. The victim's name still exists in records, still appears in databases, still classified as a cold case resolved through procedural determination. But in the minds of those who worked it, that label no longer carries its original meaning. It is no longer about a mystery solved. It is about a structure understood. And structures do not disappear when understood. They persist in how systems behave afterward, in how cases are categorized, in how information is filtered, in how thresholds are defined, in how quickly certain lines of inquiry are no longer pursued. Weeks later, reports are finalized. Summaries are written. Language is carefully chosen, neutral, administrative, precise, because language is the final layer of containment, not of truth, but of interpretation. Inside one of those reports, a single line appears that reads cleanly, almost clinically. Case concluded due to sufficient systemic clarification of disappearance conditions. No mention of closure as justice. No mention of closure as resolution. Only clarification. And even that word feels heavier than intended. Because clarity, in this case, does not simplify. It exposes scale. Elsewhere, the suspect's file is processed through standard channels. Not as a confession, not as an indictment, but as a record of participation in a system that no longer exists in the form it once did, yet still leaves its traces in how the past is understood. No final confrontation remains. No final reversal. Only the quiet persistence of what was uncovered. And somewhere, far from the interrogation room, far from the evidence boards and reconstructed timelines, the absence that started it all remains unchanged, not as a gap waiting to be filled, but as a completed function inside a structure that once required it to be that way. And that is the final, unsettling truth the case leaves behind. Some disappearances are not endpoints in a story. They are outputs of a system that continues to function long after the story has been told. Long after the case is filed away, long after the rooms are cleared and the language of conclusion replaces the language of investigation, there is still one thing that refuses to behave like closure, and it is not the suspect, not the investigators, not even the documents. It is the pattern itself, because patterns do not respect administrative endings, they only respect structure. Inside archived systems, the case exists now as metadata. Indexed, compressed, retrievable only through specific classification pathways that most users will never encounter unless they already know what they are looking for. But even in that reduced form, it still produces echoes. Not literal echoes, behavioral ones. Small statistical anomalies in how similar cases are categorized afterward. Slight shifts in how missing is defined in edge scenarios. Subtle tightening of what qualifies as insufficient evidence for escalation. No one announces these changes. No one connects them to a single origin point. And that is exactly why they persist. Outside the formal record, the people who work the case do not speak about it in dramatic terms. They do not call it solved. They do not call it unresolved. They refer to it indirectly, carefully, as the framework case, because what they encountered was not just a disappearance, but a structure that shaped disappearance itself. Inside memory, however, it behaves differently. For the detective who led the final interrogation, the case does not end when the file closes. It ends in fragments, phrases that return without warning, reconstructed sentences that surface in unrelated moments, the cadence of answers that no longer belong to any active conversation but refuse to fully disappear. Controlled visibility. Non-integratable information. Resolution instead of failure. These phrases do not feel like evidence anymore. They feel like architecture. And architecture, once understood, cannot be unseen. Months later, a quiet review is conducted, not public, not official, but procedural in tone, assessing how the case was handled across decades. The language used is neutral, but the implications are not. There are no findings of misconduct, no actionable violations, but there is acknowledgement of systemic information asymmetry during initial investigative phases. A phrase so carefully constructed it avoids naming anything directly while still confirming that the conditions of the investigation were never fully balanced. Inside that review, one line stands out more than the rest. The case demonstrates interaction between individual investigation and distributed information governance structures. It is the closest the record comes to saying what everyone already knows, but cannot formally state in simpler terms. The disappearance was not just investigated. It was filtered. Outside, life continues in the neighborhood where it began. The house remains occupied by new residents who know only fragments of its history. A missing person case. A cold case. A long unsolved disappearance. Nothing that reveals structure. Everything that preserves narrative simplicity. And that simplicity is important because complexity is fragile when exposed too widely. Inside that same neighborhood, people still occasionally remember her name, but memory behaves differently now. Less like grief, more like residue, something that remains after the system that once gave it urgency has moved on. And somewhere, in the deeper layers of archived classification, the case remains exactly where it was placed. Not erased. Not active. Just contained. But containment is not absence. It is a condition. And conditions can persist indefinitely without ever becoming visible again. The final report never states that truth directly. It does not need to, because anyone who worked close enough to the case already understands it in a way that does not require language anymore. The last line of the file is simple, almost unremarkable. No further investigative action recommended. And yet, for those who read it with full context, it reads differently. Not as closure, but as continuation under a different form. Because the most unsettling part of the entire case was never the disappearance itself. It was the realization that disappearance, in certain systems, is not an event that happens once. It is a state that is maintained. And once you recognize that, you stop asking where she went, and start noticing how quietly the system still knows how to make it happen. Years later, the case is no longer active, no longer cold, no longer even revisited. It exists in a quieter category reserved for things that have already been understood at the highest administrative level and therefore no longer require movement, only preservation, like a sealed artifact that continues to shape perception even while appearing inert. Inside institutional memory, the disappearance from Florida, 1995, is referenced only indirectly. Not by name, not by victim, but by classification shorthand that carries meaning only for those who once stood close enough to the investigation to recognize its structure. And even then, it is rarely spoken aloud. Because some cases do not end with answers, they end with awareness, and awareness is not something systems like to circulate freely. Outside those archives, the world has already moved on. New cases replace old ones. New headlines replace old mysteries. Cold cases become content, statistics, background noise in a larger system that depends on constant replacement to maintain emotional distance. But every so often, something echoes back. A pattern flagged. A procedural adjustment. A subtle shift in how risk exposure is defined in unrelated investigations. No one links it publicly to anything from the past. No one needs to. The structure no longer requires attribution to function. It only requires replication. Inside one of the quietest rooms in a federal archive facility, a retired investigator sits with a copy of the final report. Not the full case file. Just the summary. The version designed to be read without destabilizing context. He reads it the same way every time. Slowly. Not because he is searching for new information, but because he is searching for the absence of it. And in that absence, he still hears fragments. Resolution. Visibility control. Non-integratable. Words that once belonged to a live investigation, now reduced to administrative language, stripped of urgency, but not of meaning. Because meaning does not disappear when language is sanitized. It just becomes harder to challenge. Outside, the neighborhood where it all began is almost unrecognizable in detail, though unchanged in structure. New paint, new ownership, new routines. But the same geometry of ordinary life that once held an extraordinary absence without ever fully acknowledging it. The house no longer carries attention. It no longer draws questions. It simply exists again as property, as space, as continuity. And that continuity is what makes the memory of interruption feel increasingly unreal to those who were never part of it. But for those who were, the case never fully returns to silence. It returns in patterns, in reflexes, in the way certain phrases in unrelated reports cause brief, unexplainable pauses. In the way closure is now read with more caution than relief. Because closure, after this case, is no longer a destination. It is a classification. And classifications can be revised without warning. In a final internal audit conducted years after the official conclusion, the language used is careful, almost hesitant, as if even the document itself understands the fragility of what it is describing. The investigation outcome reflects systemic constraints on information consolidation during the period of initial response. It does not say failure. It does not say suppression. It does not say intent. But it does not need to. Because those who read it with full context understand that constraints are rarely accidental when they persist in consistent direction. And at the very end of that audit, there is a single line that is never highlighted, never quoted in summaries, but never removed either. No anomaly detected within operational parameters of the governing framework at the time of resolution. That sentence is what remains. Not justice, not truth, not even mystery. Just confirmation that whatever occurred fit within something large enough to contain it without breaking. And that is where the story finally settles, not in answers, not in exposure, but in recognition that some systems do not resolve cases in the way people expect. They absorb them. And once absorbed, the case is no longer about what happened in 1995. It is about how easily what happened can become indistinguishable from how things are allowed to happen at all. And in that realization, the final silence is no longer empty. It is structural.